Moshi Moshi, my friends. Hello. My name is Kohi Zenji, or Kai, for some of you guys who already know me. Um, I will give my brief introduction. I was asked to record for your guys' D2L a brief-ish module explaining Mahayana Buddhism. So a broad sweep I'll do. First off, I'll go ahead and introduce myself and my credentials. Kaiko Hizenji, of course. My undergrad is in humanities / philosophy from MSU, represent. And my master's is in Buddhist studies from the University of South Wales. I have always had a passion to teach, so I would like to say it is an honor and a privilege to teach this lecture and for you to take the time to watch it and to listen to it as well. I'm no dry box of rice, so I'll try to keep this as enjoyable as possible. So essentially, Buddhism. The broad sweep is that there's this idea of nirvana being the dissolving of existence, as well as samsara, which is the interconnected, interdependent suffering in life. The thoughts of Mahayana, as opposed to Theravada, seek to dispel the illusion that these two worlds are in contrast or any dualism, and that they're actually two parts of the same mental module. You'll see that reoccurring in a lot of themes in many of these different offshoots of Buddhism. I have been asked specifically to make a video here for Eastern Buddhism, Northeastern Buddhism, classified by mostly Vietnam, Korea, China, Japan. So in this movement, we'll go ahead and start. I will say that many of these have Chinese classifications because of the route in which Buddhism traveled throughout India on to the Northeast and the different routes brought on by trade. So many of these are going to have Chinese classifications, but being that I am a Japanese studied Zenji, I do kind of default to the Japanese classifications and names. So it's either going to be that or the Americanized names of them, or English names for them. So my apologies to any of my non-Japanese students that are wanting to learn about Chinese Chen or other derivatives of Buddhism. So I will go ahead and just give that classification there. So we'll go ahead and try to keep it easy. For first timers, I normally, with Buddhism, because it is such a native concept to especially Abrahamic religions who have never studied the onset of Asian culture religions, I go based on recognition. So first off, you guys have already learned about possibly Theravada. The recognition for me on this accord is to classify Theravada as old school Buddhism. It's the original. It's the Sanskrit Pali derivative from India, straight from Gautama himself. It's what like I said, I refer to as old school, Old Testament, conservative, very deity-based flavor of Buddhism. Mahayana is what I refer to as new school in comparison to Theravada, or if you've ever heard this term, Hinayana. It's derogatory in the way that Hinayana, as referred to as Theravada, Hinayana means a lesser vehicle, whereas Mahayana means a greater vehicle. So it's kind of a pass at them. So very basic offset of doctrinal dispute falls at the door of defining enlightenment for these two schools, what it is and how long it takes to get to them. The old school or Theravada system says that many lifetimes, many rebirths, a different level of different levels of existence, It also categorizes a litany of different levels of awakening, samyak sambuddhis, mahasattvas, bhumis, pratyekcha buddhas, arhats. Listen, for lack of for saving time, I'm just going to go ahead and say there are 32 different celestial realms, and they each have classifications, even down to the bugs that roam the earth. So we'll just save that time. Just know that it's a very, very long list. Just as an anecdote, before I get into the main schools of Mahayana, I do want to say that there are 3 different forms of main Buddhism. There are your first, Theravada, your second, Mahayana, and your third, which is a sub branch of Mahayana, which is called Vajrayana. It's essentially what you're going to be looking at in Tibet, your Tibetan Buddhist practices, which will sort of semi be covered in this brief lecture because of the Pure Land forms and the Shingong forms, the esoteric forms, the tantric forms. They tend to take on a Mahayana, Vajrayana role. So I'll get to those later on. Mahayana, just in total though, as just a blanket statement, the general doctrine slides past this hard karmic retribution of the old school Theravada and opted for a more humanistic interaction. Not only that, but the main tenet places an importance on the Bodhisattva. This is a Bodhisattva is one who not only takes on the path of Buddhahood or awakening, but also vows to teach others. There's also a sub-classification for a Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva is also one who has enough stuff to attain nirvana, but decides to opt out and come back and be reincarnated as whatever whatever being they decide that is best fit to teach other humans about nirvana and the Dharma, the Buddha teachings. So that could be animals. That's essentially that attitude that was adopted essentially by the Hindi prospect of essentially why they a lot of Hindi cultures revere certain animals as venerable and do not partake in eating them. So it's a very, very far off and much more calibrated process, and it has since been evolved into many different forms to become what we know as Bodhisattva. So that's just a very general blanket statement. So please don't do me too wrong on that one if I'm way off on that. But that's the general idea. The most important part of all of these distinctions, wherever you go on this Mahayana term, is the nature in which this Buddhahood, like I said, whatever the classification, lays existentially. Theravada argues, like I said, this heavily earned karmic regiment, reincarnations of Buddhahood over many lifespans, while Mahayana argues the ability to do that in one lifetime via upaya or expedient means, whereas where awareness is innate. That's a big deal too. Awareness or this potential for that Buddhahood is already within. It's already built within. Instead of reaching out for the karmic values and doing good things for karmic sake to come back onto your, I guess, score of Buddhahood. Buddhahood in Mahayana is built in. It's already there. You just have to, unearth it. That's something called Buddha nature, is what we call, or Busho in Japanese, Buddha nature, something that's already in there. Within the Mahayana preview, the divisions from there are all how to best cultivate unearthing that Busho, or Buddhahood from within yourself, that innate process. Much as these divisions also have a flavor of already existing folk traditions within the communities that they start to travel towards too. So you will see that in things like Zen and Chan. You have your folk religions that are already there, and this Mahayana comes in there. Essentially, long and short, with Chan coming from China to Japan in the formulation of Zen, there are a lot of different modules that aren't really reflected from the Chinese process of Chan. They're just distinctly Japanese in Zen, and Chinese Chan has that as well. So, with that brief and hopefully clear summary, let's get into the different, for lack of better terms, denominations. The very beginnings of Mahayana debatably start in the 2nd century, and just as a general rule of thumb, we're going to go ahead and state that most of these divisions and branches are they come way with contenders. For example, after the offshoot of Theravada and Mahayana, between their basic offshoot was between consciousness and what that means to karmic value. But after even Mahayana splits off from Theravada, it also from within itself has a dispute between consciousness and existence. So the tail of the tape for the first primary offshoot within Mahayana is Nagarjuna championing Madhyamaka, and Asanga and Vasubandhu championing Yogacara. So remember Nagarjuna, because he is considered, I consider him the granddaddy of many Mahayana schools, if not all of them. Again, I hope I'm not going too far with reaching for all of them. So that being said, we'll start with Yogacara so that I can get to the points of Nagarjuna and his Madhyamaka schools after. So the central notion of Yogacara is that everything that can be perceived is a mental formation. Everything that exists is just a reference point of simulated process. Outside of the process of knowledge or reference, items and objects external have no changeable reality. This isn't Rene Descartes. I think, therefore I am, because Yogacara takes it a step further, stating that there are no objects, yet there are also no subjects who perceive those objects. Yogacara explains perception as a process of creative imagination, explained by an idea called storehouse consciousness. It basically formulates an idea where there are all these previous karmic expression or impressions, and they flow about the universe. And when someone dies and rekindles in a form of somewhat chaos theory, it is that they seem to state and modulate that it's all precise. It's all within that karmic value system that is distinct and precise, maybe unknown to human nature and the mind, but it is precise. So in this way, these small little bundles that do refashion themselves back together gain a conscious perception of the I that exists based on individual forms of sense consciousness within the mind. So basically, all of these different formulations of consciousness come back together in this wild, chaotic, but very systematic form of existence and pop back together, and they all have simulations within that consciousness that want to define itself as I. So that's where they explain the formulation of a person believing who and what they are. That's where the argument for Nagarjuna tends to go south. He, again, is the founder of Madhyamaka, the school, Madhyamaka school, which is, again, I will say, one of the most basic keystones of many of the Mahayana traditions fall their path back onto Madhyamaka and Nagarjuna's way of thought. Nagarjuna was best known for this developed dialectic based on reduction ad absurdum. He would do this to his opponents, advantages, and basically dismantle them that way. This book right here is the middle way path. I do advise, if upside down, backwards, if you do want to read more about Nagarjuna and the basic tenets of all of Madhyamaka or Mahayana thought, this is where you get it. And I'll tell you why. Because his argument system within that book is pretty dope. So, being that he is an Indian logic debater back when, he uses this logic called katutskoti. It's very closely related to the Greek tetralemma, or the four-corner argument. Madhyamaka and Yogacara parallel in many ways of thought, but essentially where the argument falls apart is at the fallacy that Yogacara has in remaining consistent with the terms of consciousness. So what I mean by that four-corner argument is, to put it very, very shortly, Nagarjuna essentially says nothing exists. And he uses a platform of four different ways to modulate the advantages for why nothing exists, but not in the sense of nihilism. So that's a very precise thing to be careful with, because a lot of people will see this four-corner argument and the branch off from Yogacara and decide, oh, okay, we're going into nihilism. That's not the way I want to go. That is not necessarily the case, because he does make very careful to tread the line of saying, hey, I am saying that these things don't exist, but there's a purpose to why they don't exist. So Nagarjuna's takeaway was that all things only exist in reference to an opposite. Okay. Thus, all things are only relative and lack real essence or existence, and are empty, or what's called the idea of sunyata. He sets up the preface that to exist, an object must do so relative to nothing outside of itself, or it is dependent. And for the example, in this book right here, Nagarjuna's middle way, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, hey, or the MMK for short, he takes many concepts and reduces them, such as cause and effect, or really any dualistic form of notion. But in specific cause and effect, he provides an argument and concludes that cause is just one dimension of the same function, and thus is not cause without effect, and vice versa. So for Nagarjuna, emptiness means the absence of an essence in things, but not their non-existence as phenomena. So he sticks real close to Gautama Buddha's middle way of neither nihilism nor indulgence. And that's the property that you're going to want to seek if you do decide to read off on the middle way. So for this reason, again, Nagarjuna is considered the father of Mahayana. So we'll move on. Next up, we have Tendai and Shingong, another contender here. Although Tendai originated in China, its Japanese evolution caused for contention in doctrine. Both schools have their ingredients in making what we know as modern Japanese Zen, but that's not so much the case with the Chinese Chan origins. But I digress. So, with in the Tang period, in the Tang Chinese period, basically it was hopping with religious discourse and sets up the preface for religious modernity in the East almost altogether. Tendai primarily focuses on the Lotus Sutra. That's very heavily incorporated within Nagarjuna's arguments as well from the Madhyamaka thought. And they actually regard him as one of the first patriarchs because of the three truths doctrine that they withhold in Tendai Sutra. So basically, that doctrine goes: all things are conditionally empty, all phenomenon, and expressions of absolute suchness, and consciousness is synthesized, or synthesis of premise 1 and 2. So basically, you have suchness and consciousness synthesized by the fact that you cannot have neither and you cannot have all. So the path of consciousness is in between those two formulations of expressions of absolute suchness. This school of Tendai stresses the notion of totality and mutual interpenetration. Rather, the identical nature of emptiness phenomenally and the middle. So again, you have this empty formation and you have this phenomenal formation, and your identity as such is navigated right in between that middle path of consciousness. So essentially, practice in Tendai consists of, again, esoteric rites, mudras, mandalas, forms of meditation. Yeah. And so you essentially push your mental formations into understanding the middle way that you are in between these two extremes. Another reoccurring theme. Again, next is Shingong. This school originates in Japan, and it's founded by a monk named Kukai. So he's important in Japanese history because he has a lot to do with being attributed, also with the formulation of Japanese modern kana writing alphabet. So essentially, you guys know the symbols that Japanese and Chinese have in their alphabet. But this is very distinct to Chinese speech. So Japanese speech essentially needed different letters and different enunciation of certain words. So essentially, Kukai is attributed with inventing this this script, and like I said, he's attributed with it because I'm a historian also of Zen, so there's a little bit of a debate between the correlation between when he got back from China and received these certain Siddham script writings and translated them into the Japanese writing, and versus when it actually got there. But anyway, so really quickly, I'm going to take like a left turn and read this small script here from Reichu Abe. He's essentially, he wrote the navigation between Saicho and Kukai. The article that he writes repraises the interaction between Saicho and Kukai, the founders respectively of the Japanese Tendai and Shingong schools of Buddhism. The new appraisal that he does is based on historical conditions in which these two men sought to introduce new types of Buddhism at the close of the age of the Nara period, rather than the conventional idealized characterizations of the two figures as the founding fathers of their respective schools. What emerges is their unregatable differences between Saicho and Kukai and their interpretive strategies for delineating the role of esoteric Buddhism, or Mikyo, in establishing a new order in the early Heian period, in the early Heian Buddhist community altogether. A difference that presented itself as a persistent tension that underlay Saicho's alliance with Kukai from the very outset of their relationship. So essentially, these two wanted to form a different form of Japanese Buddhism, in respectively Tendai with Saicho and Shingong with Kukai, and had complete doctrinal differences and decided they ghosted each other, essentially, if those terms. So that's why these two are so closely related, and you'll see why here. With Shingong, the school originates, obviously, like I said, in Japan, by monk Kukai. It's seeded with the teachings of Mitsung, which again, Tendai did form in China with Tiantai, but does have the same premise of Mitsung's Chinese teachings. Kukai took these teachings and developed an entirely different Shingong formulation in Japan. His focuses on the idea of the three secrets: mind, body, and speech. Again, we have these three secrets, these three truths. These three functions, the mind, the body, the speech, these are the three functions that guide to the attainment of enlightenment. The formulations and truths and in these rituals connected to those secrets are given by Dharma transmission, or passed down orally from master to student. So as such, the celestial teacher, which expounded the absolute truth of these lessons, is known as Vairocana, which again, you will see Vairocana in Vajrayana Buddhism as well, which is, like I said, is the offshoot, the little brother to Mahayana as a whole. Vairocana is the primary deity and is viewed as the universe itself, manifested into the six worldly elements. Again, Vairocana and their transition into manifesting the things within this phenomenal world are key with realizing which ones they are within the Mahayana works. So these six worldly elements are fire, air, wind, earth, space, and consciousness. Thus, to evoke these natures, words fall short and can only be represented through artistic expression. That's the only way to actively receive the understanding of Vairocana and put it out into the world. Another reoccurring theme in Zen and Chan, based on the art and the poetry of the Tang, specifically the Tang period. And again, another very touchy topic with the Japanese formulation, but that's neither here nor there. So within these, the pantheon, there are even deities dedicated to vigilance over consciousness and celestial realms and connect the phenomenon to this world. Fudomyo is one of them, or known as Akala in other forms of Buddhism, but Fudomyo is his name in Japanese. Akala is another Vairocana Buddhist deity. Just look them up. Trust me, you will go into a rabbit hole with how many, the directions they cover, the worlds they're in, such and such. So next, closely related, we have Pure Land. Their sutra, a focus is the Infinite Life Sutra, the Contemplation Sutra, and most importantly, the Amitabha Sutra. So within, like I said, the pantheon of Buddhist deities, there are a variety of different distinctions on what they do. Pure Land focuses almost exclusively on and through the view and expression and experience of Amitabha Buddha. The very basic premise of this is the world, and this is kind of defeating because I hate to just classify this overall premise, but this is essentially what you get. The overall premise for Pure Land is that this world will never not be corrupt. So the best thing for one in their consciousness to do is to strive for rebirth in another plane known as Pure Land. For Pure Land followers, repetition of mantra pushes one to realize the single universal mind, revealing the mantra's profound teachings, just almost in the same way as Shingong, when you do the esoteric rites and the mantras for reading. So my Pali and Sanskrit are very horrible, so I'm going to try to get through to this. Normally, the readings and the mantras would go as such. Namo Amitabhaya Tagatha Taya Tavyata Amrato Bhava Amta Sabbam Bhava Amtam Vikrante, so on and so forth. I don't want to keep butchering that up. So in the Japanese formulation, it's much easier for my enunciation. It's very, very shortened, and you will see that a lot with the Japanese forms of mantra readings, is that they basically take this giant Sanskrit or Pali, formulate it down, and make it into a really good soundbite, such as Namo Amitabutsu. So that allows more formulations for you to say it. Just like if you have one of these, this is called a mala. You would essentially, it's like a Buddhist rosary. For Mahayana and Theravada have them. So this one right here has 108 beads on it. Depending on what form of Mahayana Buddhism, you could have more. I do not honestly remember which one has more. I believe that, I don't even want to go ahead and try and speculate. So Namo Amitabutsu, Namo Amitabutsu, Namo Amitabutsu, Namo Amitabutsu, Namo Amitabutsu, Namo Amitabutsu, Namo Amitabutsu. So essentially what you do is you say them over and over, and it forms a cacophony almost, and creates a euphoric sense, sort of like the om that you would hear with the Hindi traditions. You would hear the om. It's basically supposed to make the sound module within the back part of your eyes and in your ears and in the right here, the third eye, vibrate and create a sense of awareness that is not normally had within the realm of reality and consciousness. So next off, we have Nichiren, which is founded by Nichiren. It is a Japanese school, and they their key and focus is the Lotus Sutra as well. They are what's called the New Lotus School. The followers of Nichiren, for them, the title itself, again, of the Lotus Sutra contains the essence of Buddhist teaching. So again, they kind of formulated this sound bite for that. And once you recite the sutra alone, it will grant the reciter benefits. very closely related to Pure Lin. Reciting the mantra brings the mind closer to the celestial properties. That can be offset into a direct benefit. So what I mean by direct benefit is I have many Nichiren friends, and so a lot of them will just, I mean, this is probably a broad sweep, but this is how it was explained to me firsthand, is that if the reciter had an obstacle of some sort or a goal to achieve or to strive for, they would recite the mantra with the objective and will into the sutra, goes out into the universe, and it comes back as the blessings that they strived for. So that mantra goes Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, so on and so forth. And you would just keep saying that until the vibes of the universe brought back onto that blessing. So there's Nichiren. Next up is, for like honorable mention, is Shinto and Taoism. What I would consider subsidiary to Buddhism, specifically for the fact that, for the sake of scope, both of these religions are oriented around the nature and celestial presence. Yet, whereas Shinto associates a deity to each element, Taoism emphasizes harmonic unity with the Tao, or the way. They both have their similarities that kind of evolved into being within Buddhist offsets of different forms of Mahayana, specifically. So Taoism emphasizes a sense of naturalness and being simply akin to the subtle formations in nature. This is where we get to see that same formulation take its place in Chan and Zen, especially in my viewpoint, in Japanese culture, mainly along the Kamakura period of poetry, and much well seen within the Heian period as well. First off, I want to preface going into Chan and Zen that I will go ahead and refer to it as Zen because it's just easier for me in my Japanese formulations to say Zen. So I do want to say that I refer to the old men in Zen as old men as a form of endearment. So, kind of like I would my Uncle Stanley. There's this ambiguity in the way of people that people see Zen masters because of the preface of how they see the Buddha. Yes, enlightenment is this funky thing and is awe-inspiring in a way, but these old dudes, as I say, see it in a different way. A cup of strong tea. You feel me? It really shouldn't be romanticized as they put it, but it very often is. In fact, if you ask one of these Zenji about, what is the Buddha, who is the Buddha, or what is it like to achieve Buddhahood, many of them have and will say shit wiping stick or 3 pounds of flax. So that's basically just built within the rhetoric and the language of Zen folk, especially the true hardcore Zen folk, like the Renzai, Linjis, the Joshus, the Nanquans. So we'll get to those. I'll start with the patriarch himself, Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma, the realest of the real, the baddest of the baddest dudes. Okay, so there is this really cool legend about how Bodhidharma was attributed with bringing tea to China. And if there's one thing to at least be considered as venerable, it will be bringing tea anywhere, specifically if it's a good old black tea, really hard green tea, anyway, or coffee, because that's what kohi means. It means coffee. Anyway, the bullet points for him: born 440 in Kanchi, the capital of Pallava, Southeast India. And he was actually the third son of a king. So apparently he gave up aristocracy for enlightenment. That was the thing back in the day, I guess. You can ask Dogen later on in the 11th century. So anyway, he traveled the southeastern Asian coast under Thai and Cambodia, and made it to China in 475. So, brief historical lesson there. The basic doctrines: no merit, meditation, centered awakening around one's already inherent capabilities, just realizing it is the point. The Buddha, anything that's venerable or revered as the Buddha is just a term. Nothing holy, nothing therein. And that's one of the Bodhidharma's quotes. Nothing holy therein. As a very broad sweep, there are two main divisions of Zen. There are very, 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 very many offshoots of schools, but I'll go ahead and stick with the two main. You have Renzai and Soto. Renzai originated in Chinese by Master Lin Chi. I'll go ahead and, like I said, I'll refer to his Japanese name, which is Renzai. It stresses the importance of koan introspection. So these koans are basically little sound bites, almost parables, that are very often referred to as illogical. But if you look at the etymology of the word koan in Chinese, where it was adopted from, it actually comes from setting a legal precedent. It would be a koan. It would be a legal document. So it's really weird. And again, this is one of my philosophical thesis that I wrote, and I won't go too far into that. It's really weird how this level of mystification onto these koans would be placed onto this word, which means legally binding document. So a koan, if I can remember one off the top of my head, a monk who really wanted to learn from Master Joshu. He was one of the bad arses in the day, so remember that name. Said, "Does the dog have Buddha nature?" And Joshu looks at him and says, "Mu." Now, the thing is in the Chinese lexicon rhetoric, mu, as I have often been explained by Chinese and Japanese scholars, mu is not a negation nor an affirmation. It basically means, like my dad used to say, or. And it's not even a in-between word like or. It's like none almost, or meh. So I say this funny joke because my personal koan is I was asking my dad about some existential philosophy way back when, and I asked him, I said, it's a yes or no question. Just answer yes or no. Which one is it? And he would very, very funnily look at me and say, or, and continue to laugh because that middle way was just so hard for me to grasp in my dualistic thinking. So those are what koans are. The method of finding enlightenment within these koan is not dependent on some notional fact, but the living experience. So another example, we have case 19 of the Mumonkan, nonsense ordinary mind. So that's another thing that's going to be a very, very huge idea within the Zen culture, is that there's nowhere to go look for this awakening. It's already there. It's in your ordinary mind. You live your life. So this story goes again, Joshu, one of the bad arses, was actually a student of Nansen. Joshu asked Nansen, what is the way? What is Zen? Or what is the Tao? Remember, that word comes up again because, the Chinese formulations of the Tao. Nansen answers, your ordinary mind. That's the way. Joshu said, can it be grasped? Can I study it? Nansen responded, the more you pursue, the more does it slip away. So this gets me in my mind to think about the lessons of your boy right here, Bruce Lee. Be like water. It's something that you really want to strive to be like. It's something that you want to hold. It's something that you want to understand and grasp, but it gets away from you until you least expect it. So Nansen's final reply to Joshu was saying, how can I know it is the way? Nansen responds with, the way does not belong to knowledge, nor does it belong to non-knowledge. Knowledge is an illusion. Non-knowledge is beyond discrimination. When you get to the way, without a doubt, you are free, like the vastness of space and unfathomable void. So how can you explain it by yes or no? There you go. Yes or no. And I'm pretty sure, oh man, it's hitting me right now that my pops was really probably making a dig at that koan in specific, and I just never realized it until now. Oh, I just had a satori, Japanese word for awakening, satori, awareness. Upon hearing this, Joshi was awakened, and apparently so am I right in this very moment. You guys caught it on camera. Check that out. So anyway, we'll move on. That is koan instruction, and that is the main goal of achieving satori awareness in Renzai. So the second school we have is Soto, founded by Dogen in Japan. And again, this is another point of contention because being a historian, I have had to evaluate the authenticity of Dogen's lineage, and I will not go there. So we will just say Dogen, Soto, Japanese. Okay. It's said to be Japanese line of Kaodong, founded in China by Dongshan. So, he says, Dogen says, I am one of the practitioners of Kaodong, learning straight from, the lineage of Dongshan. But like I said, we won't go there. Soto stresses the importance of shikantaza, like a ritual praying meditation. Some people will get really mad at me for saying ritual praying meditation, but shikantaza, that's what it is. Zazen, or zazen, known as just sitting. It's a contemplative introspection that focuses on calming the mind to pursue the inner equanimity within the world. At many levels, it seeks to do the same as the koan introspection, where the quandary falls between the self and the attempting to remove the self from the order of perception. The main beef between these two schools are what practice is optimal for becoming aware of that innate awakening and the logistics of depth and speed, as in awareness attained gradually in small spurts or experiences, or one big old awareness. Boom. There are even subsidiary disputes on what mental frame one has after the fact. But to my brand of Zen, all of that is piety. All of it doesn't matter. So the Zen tradition has a philosophical corpus which has mostly been expressed through various arts. And within these arts, there's an underlining connotation for emotive expression. Therefore, to see Zen, one would not seek scholarly approach, but look to like sumi-e prints, haiku, um, karenaiso, ukiyo-e, nanga, all kinds of stuff, even the koans. Yeah, excuse my translations of these too. So, my Japanese is harsh at best. So if you guys are laughing at me, I get it. But yeah, I mean, most of these things usually depict nature and life in its raw form. So again, that's back to that Shingong representation of nature is the only way to do it is by art. But even then, unless the art is embodied by the observer, as in I'm seeing the art, it can only be looked upon as a disconnected visual representation. What is represented or what it represents is by its very definition self-defeating in so much as the beauty per se consists in its being ephemeral. The practitioner is attempting to, in these koans, in these arts, capture a moment where the moment has already gone. So that's another concept within Zen, the momentariness that you'll see a lot if you begin to read. The perspective of recalling, such as satori, or your awareness, changes it, leaving the faintest trace. Yet Zen relishes in its own paradox of this contradicting gesture. In this case, satori, awakening, is something no one else can give you. And it's not really good to express because you really can't. You had that moment, it's in here, you can't give it. So the premise of satori is discovering whether there is now freedom from clinging or attachment. The study of Zen becomes divorced from the actual lived experience of Zen. Master Mumon, writer of The Gateless Gate, another great book of koans. If you really like these koans, I'm telling you, they're fire. They're just like awesome, really sweet, straight to the point parables. And some of them will make you laugh. Some of them you'll be like, I have no idea what I just read. It doesn't make any sense, but that's the point. He said, if you understand the first word of Zen, you will know the last word of Zen. That last word, or the first word, it is not a word. The assertion is being made that there are conceptual limits to what can be said or expressed about that moment, or Zen, just in general. The context to be evaluated is whether or not this epiphany stands to be genuine, like a genuine insight to reality, or a hypercontextualization of it. It could be either or. It could be both. Further, Zen implies that any description made about it or enlightenment by knowing it will at best pale in comparison because it can only be lived. One of my favorite koans is one of Master Joshu. Again, like I said, he's a badass. Back then, all of these young monks they would want to travel in search of a master who can snap their fingers and illuminate them. And just sort of a bow staff to the forehead, they could, but not by giving you the answer, the direct answer to that question that you wanted, but by giving you something you may not have intended to come for. So, for example, you have case 7 of the Mumonkan. Joshu's washing the bowl. Young monk asked Joshu, I've just entered your monastery. I beg you to teach me Zen. I beg you. Joshu asked, have you eaten your rice porridge? And the monk's like, I have. Joshu said, then sit. Go wash your bowl. The monk was then enlightened, basically taking all of those preconceived notions inside that bowl, tossing them out. Because if you really want to learn Zen, you have to get rid of all of those dualistic thinking and these ideals of normal and these very, archaic substructs of thinking. You got to get rid of them. Start with fresh water. So the boil down point of Zen is to get to the sense of self versus others, to let that go, and open one's perceptions to a more allocentric way or order of perception, naturally and instinctually. But what about practice, people say? What about meditation and becoming a Buddha and the koans? I will say the great thing about Dogen is that he did write the Genjo Koan, which is actualizing the fundamental point. So essentially finding those fundamental points within the reality that you live in, and giving prize to believe that all forms are equally endowed with the potential to discover their Buddhahood. Not from an external process of, say, some kind of magic hukuduku, but just realizing it. A really good one was, my pops would say, look how those trees sway. That's it. That's the way. And so it's the subtle movements of the universe that are kind of collectively speaking at all points. We just don't see them because we have all this other crap going on in our life. We have school to go to, we have things to study, so on and so forth. We have our jobs, we have bills. Stopping and smelling the roses, or stopping not to pick the roses, as D.T. Suzuki says. Don't pick it, observe it. Don't be scientific by killing it. Anyway, so speaking of D.T. Suzuki, he speaks a lot about consciousness in Zen. It's one of my favorite things to read about him, and the properties of how this innate manifestation is truly understood. His idea was on instinct and how satori, or that Japanese word again for awakening, is subjective. It's a subjective state of consciousness. So I will conclude this talk with the inspiration D.T. Suzuki spoke of with Yagyu Taji no Kami, samurai back when. So he spoke of the samurai's rigid training and precision and technique. And if you've ever seen any kind of martial art, the devotion to the craft and the very rigid process of learning and relearning this art form. So he says, when a swordsman stands against his opponent, he is not to think of the opponent, not himself, nor the enemy's sword movements. He just stands there with his sword, which, forgetful of all technique, is really only to follow the dictates of the unconscious. The man or woman has effaced himself as the wielder of the sword. When he strikes, it's not him, but the sword in the hands of the unconscious that strikes. So, with that is the ingenuity that Zen wishes to give without speaking at all. So, that's the long and short of it. Really, more the long of it. I've taken enough of y'all's time. I really appreciate you guys listening to this, what I guess could be considered as a Dharma talk. Yeah. If you would like to reach me, I will go ahead and put my email somewhere in the formulation of this mix. You'll see it in the description of whatever video or whatever kind of link that Dr. Jun has for you. By the way, might I state at the very, very end of this, I'm honored and privileged that Dr. Jun would have me speak, especially being that he has been the greatest mentor I've had since my father passed away in 2008. Dr. Jun has taught me much about philosophy and has even helped me gain access into receiving my master's degree, because without him, I wouldn't have had those resources. And without him, I wouldn't have known the greater philosophy that my mind could possibly have unlocked. I want to say my experience with Zen is troublesome at times because, I get into those perplexed moments where I do gain this great doubt, but that's absolutely normal. Dr. Jun has always been there for me to, bounce ideas off of him. He is even a humongous resource for how I got my master's thesis written. Without him, I was a crying, babbling mess at the end of all of it. At the beginning of all of it, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to formulate thoughts. I lost my mind, and he helped fish me back in a lot of ways. Just as many forms of Zen masters or writers of Zen would say, your Zen master, he's not really there to do anything to you or for you. He's basically like a midwife to your existential awakening experience. He's just kind of there to. So, on that note, thank you so much again for listening. Thank you, Dr. Jun, for having me. Many, many blessings. And I'll see you guys very soon. Hopefully.